Welcome back to the room where it happened. This is Don sitting in the host chair today. Happen to be joined by part of our room where it happened / Fork in Time crew. Today, joining us on today's episode, this is room number 7 for those of you that are playing at home and are keeping score. I'm joined by Robert Koshu. Robert, how are you this evening as we're recording here, the room where it happened?
Good, Don. Glad to be back on after a little hiatus.
Good to have you back too, Robert. And I'm joined also by, well, you know him from, he's a man of many faces, a man in many places. That would be Chris Capola. And I'm not even going to tell you to say hi to the good people, Chris, because that's what you'll do if I tell you to say hi to good people. So I'm just going to say, hi, Chris.
Hi, Don.
All right. I'll figure out a better way to introduce Chris at some show at some point in the future. Just stay tuned, guys. So as you guys know, we often cross over between our two podcasts here, Fork in Time and The Room Where It Happened. The purpose of The Room Where It Happened, though, is a little bit different than Fork in Time. We're here to talk more real history. We'll definitely get into the what ifs because that's just what we do. We're wired that way, and that's why these two things are connected. But our room today, we're going to, and Alexis can't join us, by the way. She is preparing for her wedding, for those of you that know of the podcasts. And so she's busy off doing more important real life things, or else I know she would be here. It's a topic that touches her famed beloved isle that she loves so much. That would be the United Kingdom and the British Isles. We're actually going to go to, I don't even know how to actually describe this. It's a place called Derby House. And what we're actually going to go to, and I just want to paint a picture for you here. There's an English sort of country manor type of scenario. And what you have, and correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen, is you have women in uniforms that are skirts on the floor with marker pins, I'll just call them for lack of a better way of describing it, tape measures, and you have guys leering through holes in walls. Does it feel like we've stumbled into the wrong type of podcast here, or is that just me?
It is definitely different.
It's definitely different. And so I will clean up any confusion that we have here. This is not some, pardon the 80s movie reference. It's not some Porky's in World War II kind of thing that's going on. But what is happening here at Derby House is the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, which has been formed, is mapping out, and they are wargaming what's going on in the Battle of the Atlantic. So most of what we're going to be talking about today is the Battle of the Atlantic, and these ladies in skirts are Wrens, which are part of the Royal Navy. These are part of the Women's Auxiliary to the Royal Navy. And they are the ones that are actually on the floor of this very large open space with measuring equipment, because they're actually measuring out distances where they're simulating what's going on in the Battle of the Atlantic with these merchant ships that are under attack by German U-boats and the escorts that are seeking to get them safely across the Atlantic, bringing vital supplies to the British Isles. And so I mentioned the guys that are looking through essentially what are peepholes or slits in the walls, is in order to make this more like the real world, where the ships that were doing the escorting work and the U-boats had limited visibility or knowledge of what the others were doing. They just give them peeks at what's going on, and then they have to respond to that. So this is their way of simulating the fact that in the real world, in the real war theater, that the participants didn't have the full knowledge of being able to look at the full exercise, the full table, if you will. So that's the way it's laid out. Then they would write and report their moves in these war games, which would then be executed by the Wrens. They would see what happens here, and they would see what the results were. Did I do a fair job of basically describing the wargaming as you understand it, Robert and Chris?
I believe so. That's really that's a good description. Matter of fact, I sent you a link to a photo that I found that I think would be. It literally shows the guys looking through the little peepholes.
There's one distinction that I do want to kind of throw in there. When you think about Great Britain, the role of women in Great Britain during the war, my mind goes to the Battle of Britain and them sitting there with long sticks moving, air raids. As I understand it, in this and also in another manor house, I feel like the manor houses really might have helped win the war for Great Britain. If they didn't have those, I don't know where these people would have gotten together. But
It's a good thing there'd been an English aristocracy, or there would have been just no place to win the wars.
I'm honestly closing my eyes and picturing a Doctor Strangelove Manor House gap. But in this unit and also at Bletchley, the Wrens and the female played an active academic intellectual role in the output. It wasn't just moving these pieces around. They were thinking up the tactics that are coming out of here. And at Bletchley, they're actively engaged in the work of programming these computers.
Right. They're not just dumb females moving the stuff around for the
Right.
guys talking. They're
Right.
actually, these were aristocracy type females would be the best way to put it. And so they were educated, they knew what they were doing, and so they were actually involved in the actual work with this. Like you said, Chris,
Right.
they were doing the calculate. They weren't waiting for the guys to say, move that ship over there. You know, they were actually doing the movements.
Yeah.
And interviewing the convoy captains as they came in, because part of what they would do is they would literally interview the convoy captains and say, okay, how did this wolf pack? And what we're talking about is, so these convoys would be coming across the Atlantic. Literally, they would build convoys up because that was the way they figured out they could defeat the U-boats, who would not attack like one sub. That's what we always think about. They would put like 20 or 30 subs at a time attacking. And so these guys would come in and the Wrens would actually do the interviews of the ship convoys, captains and leaders, and figure out, okay, what did the subs do? So they had to ask the right questions on top of everything else.
I think both of you make very important points there about first of all, the roles that these women played in what they were actually doing here. They weren't just the movers of the pieces on the board. And the other part, and as you will point out, Robert, this was an interactive process where they were coming up with scenarios and ideas. They were interviewing the successful convoys that were coming across, the commanders, getting real-time intelligence. What did you see? What's going on out there? How is the war adapting? Because it was constantly adapting. Both sides were adapting tactics. And then, playing out those scenarios again, figuring out how you would defeat that. And they came up with, and this is one of those instances where we talk about, you'll find this in the show notes. I'm going to be putting a lot of stuff in the show notes because we literally could spend an hour and a half just going through some things that are in some excellent YouTube videos and other articles that'll give somebody more of the background for this, which is how I first became aware of that. But I think you both made very, very valid points there in terms of the role that they played. And also the other thing that jumped into my mind is that, the roles of the naval commanders, which were men, these were the ones who were either going to go out or had been out. They're the ones that are changing in this process. The women that were here were pretty much the constant. So they had the consistency frame all the way through this about what was working both out at sea, what was working in the war, in the simulation room, what's happening in the war games. Chris, I'm having a real difficult time getting away from your Dr. Strangelove reference. When you mentioned the Manor House, I want to say something like, of course there are manners in the mind your manners in the Manor House versus there's no fighting in the war room, something like that. I have an idea about what the title of this particular room may end up being at the.
It's the Manor House gap. That's
Yeah, as to what we're going there. But of course, Bletchley, the other one that's mentioned, most people would know it from the work that was done in code breaking, which was so critical to code breaking in World War II. What happened in cryptography was huge in all aspects of that war, in the European theater, in the Pacific theater as well. I mean, if it's not for the work of mathematicians during World War II, essentially, you can imagine very different outcomes. And so, just to again set the context, I think most of our listeners, because they're history folks, will know this, is the challenge is England is an island nation. And it has limited resources and all types of resources, and particularly the types of resources that will sustain a population. And so it is dependent upon, there's a reason that Britannia ruled the waves. Britannia needed to rule the waves historically for lots of reasons, but particularly in World War II, and Chris, you were pointing this out right before we started recording off podcast. A big game changer in World War II is when France falls. And suddenly Nazi Germany is not just occupying France, but they're not occupying the French coastline, which gives them direct access to the Atlantic, gives them obviously directly across the English Channel from England proper, from the British Isles. We think about the Battle of Britain, which is the air war that goes on, which is an important part here. But this sea war, which is referred to often as the Battle of the Atlantic, was also incredibly important. Did I miss anything on the big setup there, guys?
Other than we talk about the Derby House, but the reality of it is it's a huge bunker system underneath the Derby House that they're still discovering. I watched a few of the YouTube videos. They're still discovering rooms in the bunker down below, and it exists because it was too intensely constructed to tear apart after the war.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I'm not sure where we want to go here with our traditional room where it happened type of approach. So I'll just open it up to whatever you want to talk about, guys. But what do you think is the most significant contribution? I guess I'll just ask this question of what went on at Derby House. If you had to narrow it down to one thing, what was the one thing that probably made the biggest difference? I'll start with you, Chris.
I'm thinking just the ability to, and what we started talking about was the importance of it. I think the most important part of this was getting Britain through to 1942. That's the most important part. By 42, middle of 42, the United States Navy has gotten involved and is carrying a lot of this carrying on a lot of this fighting. The important part is kind of that gap between, I would say, September of 40, where the Blitz and the Battle of Britain has failed. So you're not going to have an immediate invasion, but sustaining Britain through to, I would say, August of 41, when the United States takes over Iceland, starts with that undeclared war and really starts moving in and taking over this. But keeping Britain in the war for that year is the most important part of this.
And I would agree with that, Chris. Robert, do you have a thought on that, or something you sound like you're about to say something?
Yeah, I was going to agree with that because that's part of it. And then I'll go ahead and make your comment, and then I'll throw one of my pieces out.
Yeah, one of the interesting things to me was I remember looking at, I just pulled them up here on the screen again, some of the statistics about either number of sinkings or the tonnage that was sunk. And you can see where the trend was with the U-boats, and then you can see the reversal in the trend, that you can see the sudden reduction in the number of sinkings or the amount of tonnage. Now, part of that, there's a lot more tonnage that's also being shipped and sent, increasing over the war. So even if you kept the losses in terms of just measured in terms of number of sinking in tons constant, there would still be more getting through, but you do see the dramatic change. And you see it as a result of the two things that you're talking about there, Chris, the U.S. formal entry into the war and very active entry into the war, but also the types of things that are going on at Derby House. And I guess to some degree, Bletchley Park needs to be mentioned here in the sense that what they were gleaning from cryptography intelligence was being fed into this to understand what the German habits were. Robert, what were you about to say?
My thing is the change of the way wargaming was viewed at that time, because prior to this, war games were those things that you played tabletop or scenarioed out. American history, one of the big things about, and I mentioned this in the pre-show, the battlefields of the Civil War that are now national parks, those were originally, they were considered defense parks or war parks. I can't remember exactly how they were termed, but they were formed by the War Department back in the day, because they would literally load up all the West Point cadets or the Army officer trainees, run them to the different battles, and assign different people different commands and say, okay, here's what happened. Okay, so now it's 2:00 on July 3rd. Pickett hasn't charged. What do you do? It's a different piece. That moved obviously to what we talked about before, where it's board games. that are set out and rolled and played when you do war game scenarios. That was always done, Don, we talked about the pre-war eras where we developed our rainbow plans based on war games, on Plan Orange, on how we would react if Japan did this, or Plan Black if Germany did a certain thing. That all changed because now they were literally wargaming it during the action. They were getting reports in, wargaming it out, and then radioing back out to a convoy in the middle of the Atlantic. Hey, try this, basically.
Right.
After they wargamed it. And that actually flowed into Iraq because that's what Stanley McChrystal did. When you look at when he did the surge and was in charge of that, if you read the book Team of Teams, he talks about that's what they were doing.
Yeah. And the other thing, I'm glad you mentioned, things like the color-coded plans that existed for the United States, for World War II that were followed or not followed to varying degrees, depending on who the general was. See Douglas MacArthur, it's like he'd never read the plans, for example, apparently, in terms of what he did. But I'm glad you brought that up because we also think of that as being more strategic than tactical. And what was really going on here to a great degree at Derby House, where they were getting down to the tactical level, the escort vessel should fall back and do this. The formation of the convoy should do this. This is how we're going to drive the U-boat, or make sure that we're in between whatever that. This was actually down to the tactical, which is why, again, they were mapping it out on the floor, drawing out the radii, issuing the commands to see what it really meant. This was not in the broads. This was down to the ship by ship, unit by unit, almost commander by commander type of thing that was going on there. So it was, as you point out, sort of real time and iterative. And it was also not grand. It was in some cases very specific. Do you speed up? Do you slow down? Where do you fire your depth charges? How do you utilize active sonar to the extent that you sort of have it, but you really don't, at this point in terms of how things worked. To me, that was also fascinating, was the fact that it was so much more tactical, I guess, than strategic. Because I think of wargaming as being a little bit more strategic when it first pops into my head.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting because they literally developed four tactics that they used.
Right. And that will be part of what we'll put in the show notes, so we don't have to go into all of those. But I highly recommend this. One of those cases, I'll go check out the show. I really do recommend to our listeners checking out the show notes. You'll learn some things. You may, if you're a World War II buff, you may have known some of these things. I think of myself as being World War II buff, and not all of these were known by me before I dug into this in terms of some of the detail there, which is what it was there. The other thing I just wanted to ask about, because I don't know if I'm the only one that suffers this misconception, so I'll bring it up in case others do. When I hear U-boat, I think submarine, and they are submarines. But this ain't Hunt for Red October submarine kind of warfare, right?
No, I've heard people quibble over that these are not submarines. These are submersible ships.
Right.
Meaning that they can go under if they need to for a very limited amount of time. And they do suffer a lot of issues when they are submerged. They cannot move as fast, and they cannot stay down as long as they like to.
Right. And so I guess most of my life I've struggled with that because I think of the modern submarine, and then I try to put it back into the World War II context, and even further back. I mean, the Germans were using U-boats before World War II as well. But just getting that, straight in my head, I just mentioned that in case others may have it in their head. This is not, they can't stay submerged, as you said, forever. In fact, they actually prefer to attack from the surface. So that's actually preferred, or they're better off if they're able to surface to attack in terms of being successful.
They actually use their deck gun. They actually had one of the small deck guns that you would normally have on a small cruiser or destroyer mounted on the sub, usually behind the conning tower, and it was actually used during these attacks.
And so that plays into, again, and this will be in the videos and the other links that we'll have. This plays into the tactics that are being developed at Derby House, because they, knowing the limited amount of time they can effectively be underwater, what that means for them, all the things that play with that were part of the tactical considerations in terms of trying to get the best advantage that could be brought forward. So again, that's me. I've raised that for me. Maybe I raised it for the benefit of somebody else, just understanding the difference between the types of vessels.
The one thing I'd talk about is in the videos you're talking about, the kind of established wisdom was that, well, this is a submarine. Of course you're going to attack when you're underwater. What else is the point of using a submarine to do this? And through the harsh audit of reality, they began realizing, no, our assumptions are wrong. In these interviews with the convoy members that made it through, they begin looking and seeing that what we thought is not the way they're being used.
Yeah. So, so one of the interesting things for me there is that I use this a lot in business. I think we talk about it a lot on the podcast. This concept that generals are always sort of fighting the last war, or that you have this such a conceived notion, either tactically or strategically, that it's very difficult to adapt to something new. And to me, that's one of the ingenious things about many winners and many wars is the side that's able to best adapt to what is new or what is different. Normally, is the victor, the one that figures out what's not working anymore. That was last war. This is this war. How are we going to do this differently? And to me, that was part of what the whole concept here about the fact that they were even choosing to war game was. They could have just kept on. And I think truthfully, both guys, is that, sheer numbers would have eventually enabled success here. The Liberty ships are being churned out at an unbelievable pace. You can, how fast they're building ships, because they're losing ships so quickly is a part of that. But just the number of U.S. naval vessels that are able to be brought to bear once they're formally in the war. You might argue that eventually, Germany was destined to fail using this tactic because eventually the numbers were just bigger than what they could deal with a limited U-boat fleet. But they didn't just rest upon the numerical advantage and what that would have meant. They looked at how they could adapt and iterate and learn, which is an important part of what's going on. As Robert will point out, this was real-time feedback being fed back in both ways. Tell us what just happened so we can feed that into the games. We're going to tell you what we just tested in the games. Now go actually take this out to sea and see if this works, which is fascinating to me.
Yeah, well, it's very much so because, like you said, Don, it was an iterative process. And we tend to think of that as a relatively new phenomena in business today of being agile, and running your agile processes. My work life is a corporate trainer, and we do agile instructional design all the time now. And, this was literally one of the first times agile was really used, which is really, to me, kind of intriguing because it was kind of forced. And I'm with you. I think England may have fell, but it definitively affects the overlord preparations if they don't fix this quicker. Right. Sheer numbers win, but how much longer does it take to build up for overlord?
Yeah, and I'm also fascinated by the fact, we know what Churchill said, particularly in response to the Battle of Britain, but when you read and see other things here, Churchill was the U-boat menace. That's normally the term that's attached to it. The U-boat menace was real, and Churchill he feared that as much as he feared what the German Air Force. What was feared that the German Air Force would be able to do, what they eventually realized was bombing alone was not going to be sufficient. So that was what was proved in the Battle of Britain, was that you were not going to be able to cause England to surrender solely by air power alone. It was going to take troops on the ground. That was the Battle of Britain. But then you have what happens with the Battle of the Atlantic. Chris, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I'd actually challenge the goal of the Battle of Britain.
Okay.
It wasn't necessary. It did not start as let's just bomb Britain and they'll give up. The whole point at the beginning of the Battle of Britain was to bomb ports, bomb airfields, and gain control over the channel so that you can launch a land invasion.
Right. Which has to be launched over water as D-Day proved, going in the other direction, which
But
is not an easy thing to do.
But again, Britain being an island, the Germans, once they conquer France, they look at it and there's kind of three, fields. There's three domains. We can win on the land. They can win on the sea. So we need to contest the air. And if we have two of the three, we can successfully invade.
Right. And yeah, I'm going to ask you if you would just to elucidate or illuminate. I'm not even sure what verb I want you to do here, Chris, but a little bit more on the significance. You mentioned this pre-show, and I alluded to it. The significance of Germany's capture of all of France. Why was that such a? I know in my head, I know why I think that's such a game changer. Why is that such a game changer?
So it actually could have gone a lot worse, but the biggest thing was the North Sea during the First World War, because that's, what Britain thinks they're going to be fighting again, was a relatively easy door to keep closed. You've got kind of a close-in blockade you can mount, kind of picture Norway down to the Low Countries. You also have kind of Scotland over to Norway again, but you've got very good ways of keeping German shipping from getting out, particularly the German Navy, from getting out into the Western approaches. The Western approaches being the Atlantic Ocean leading to Bristol, leading to Liverpool, which are the ports on the western side of Britain, which is where you would naturally land anything coming from, I'm going to say, the entire Western Hemisphere. And the reason I stress the Western Hemisphere is it's not just the United States, it's wheat from Manitoba. That's another huge thing to keep Britain eating.
It's Canada as part of the Commonwealth
Yes.
that is initially the huge part of this. The United States, obviously, because of Lend-Lease and then the other goods that are coming over, are part of it as well. But you're right. You're right. It's Canadian grain.
At the beginning of the Battle of Britain, the only fully equipped division that the Commonwealth, that the Allies had in Great Britain, was Canadian. So it could have gone a lot worse in that, now they have this entire coast, the Bay of Biscay, where you can easily, ship out. But they got lucky in that, I'm going to talk about Catapult, which was the British operation where they went to the French fleet in North Africa and said, hey, you're either going to surrender or we're going to attack our former allies. That's important because the French have a huge navy compared to even the Germans. So I'm picturing, there's all of these scares about Bismarck and Tirpitz and these cruisers, Scharnhorst, getting loose in the Atlantic. The French Navy has dozens of these. And one of the things Churchill did as soon as France surrendered is he said, okay, we can't do anything about Brest and Bordeaux, but we can do something about this fleet. We cannot allow these ships to start being used against us, because that was another, if that happens, that's a even worse situation.
Right. And we're not talking there about U-boats being the threat. We're talking about the entire German, now occupied Vichy French Navy that's now part of the German war machine that changes the balance of naval power.
That has dozens of full battleships, that has cruisers, that has all of these surface ships that, frankly, Germany focused on kind of what's called an asymmetrical threat. They said, you know what? Hey, Kaiser Wilhelm again. We tried building a surface fleet. It didn't work out. We don't have the resources to do it. So what we need to do is build cheap U-boats that can get around and that can challenge these big British battleships at a cut rate price.
Right. It's death by paper cut, if you will. If you've got enough paper to bring, you can cause enough cuts. Well, and the other thing too is remember that there had been a number of treaties and agreements, and those treaties and agreements on the naval side were around limiting the size, number, and scope of large capital vessels.
Treaty of Washington.
Yeah, battleships
and
heavy cruisers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there was no, as far as I know, there were no restrictions placed inside of that on smaller craft or on U-boats. That was a way to get
U-boats
around.
And aircraft carriers were exempt, which is one reason why Japan, for example, jumped to the aircraft carrier,
right,
and built so many of those. Yeah, there were, looks like 4 or 5 battleships from the French Navy that were involved. I'm sitting there. I looked real quick, Chris. I had totally forgot about that. And yes, and 6 destroyers and a seaplane tender, and that's a sizable. That almost, I don't know if it would have doubled, but it would have definitely increased the German Navy by 30 to 40%.
Yeah, yeah. Again, like the Bismarck, one battleship threw the entire Royal Navy into a panic, 4 times as much. What does that do?
Right. And so again, the starting question there, Chris, that you did a good job of explaining was the importance of from the German perspective, the German occupation of France, giving them ports that they could sally directly into the Atlantic from, versus, as you said, keeping the door closed, the North Sea access. It was tougher to get out to the open Atlantic and to the western approaches if you're only functioning from the ports that Germany had before occupying and gaining access to the French coast, to the Atlantic coast of France, as a result of what's going on here. So for those of you that haven't seen the movie, I know I'm going to reference here something that is not Chris's favorite thing. It's on Apple TV. I'm sorry, Chris, but last summer, the movie Greyhound, which featured Tom Hanks, actually talks about, shows very much Saving Private Ryan style version of the Battle of Atlantic. He's an American commander that's an escort commander, and so I also recommend that for folks who want to get a sense for what it was like to be at sea when these things are going on. Again, I can't help but be struck by, because it's Tom Hanks in both, sort of the Saving Private Ryan-esque nature of showing what the action was really about, and just showing it in real time in some cases there to get a sense on what it was like to be out at sea. And granted, we talked about the limitations of U-boats, but not knowing where the enemy was. You're blind. They would get outside of the areas they could be patrolled by aircraft. There was limited range of optics, visual optics from the escorting fleets and from what they were escorting, the actual cargo ships. And then, we don't have, again, don't think Hunt for Red October. You don't have active sonar and all these passive listening things. I mean, this was good old fashioned submarine, Das Boot-ish kind of warfare that's going on here.
Yeah, they would run almost 80 to 90% of their time above the water. And that was one reason why the worst time for the convoys was night, because they would take advantage of being at night, because they could stay on the surface and attack much easier at night, because they were the easiest way to think about it. Big ship sits up. If anybody thinks about a big boat like a cruise, if you've been next to a cruise ship, you look up and it's 10, 15 stories high. Warships at that time weren't that. Maybe they're 5 or 6 stories high. A U-boat sits 5 feet above the water, maybe 10 at most. So you're trying to spot this thing from a ship in the middle of the ocean, and
if the seas are rolling at all, it can sort of hide behind what's going on with the rolling seas as well. So again, we didn't fully plan out or talk about all the places that we would go here. I'm going to throw a little what if here, a nod to our fork in time approach. It was hit on a little bit before. What if there is no Derby House? What if there's no adaptation of tactics here? we talked about, I asked this question off podcast, so I'll go for either of you guys here. I mean, was there ever really a risk of England falling? I know, Robert, you said you thought so. I'm curious to see if Chris agrees the same. Was this a real risk, or yes, it turned out the way it did, but it would have eventually happened. It was inevitable that that England was not going to fall.
I'm thinking it depends on how fast the U.S. can ramp up from the simple battle of the Atlantic in 41, because that didn't happen until Lend-Lease was passed in March of 41. How fast can we ramp up? Can we keep ahead? And then if Britain falls, let's just do a little what if. What if they fall? Does that affect, how much of the British Navy do they get? At that point, because and I think at a bare minimum, and Chris, maybe we talk about this, Overlord is definitely delayed by a year or more, because it takes us longer to get our equipment over there to set up for Overlord. Because part of the problem with Overlord is the amount of material you needed to really do Overlord.
So I'm thinking about a couple of things here. First, the only change we're making here is no adaptation of tactics, so we have more losses. Right. I'm going to recount a story from the Potsdam Conference where, trust me, this is going to make sense in a second, where one of the, and I don't know whether it was an American or a British officer, talked to Stalin and said, how good does it feel that you're now in Berlin? You're in the heart of fascist Germany. And Stalin looked at this officer and he said, Alexander made it to Paris. Stalin makes it to Paris. Stalin makes it to Western Europe. That is the difference here. That
you're thinking a different post-war scenario.
Very different post-war scenario, because if you do delay it, if you delay Overlord, literally, you just said delay Overlord 1 year.
Yep.
So we're gonna land 2 months after Germany surrenders in our scenario. I do think it's interesting to think about what does that do to the British strategy of the Mediterranean, because we had troops on mainland Europe in September of 43 when we landed in southern Italy. If we're not going to be able to mount a cross-channel invasion, maybe we actually put a little more effort into the Mediterranean, because the other thing is, if thinking about a map here, you can threaten the approaches to Britain, but you can't really, from there, you still have a pretty long reach to get to the more southerly central Atlantic. So we could probably ship to Gibraltar, ship to Sicily, ship to Greece, and open up some of these southern fronts, because the fall of France made Britain so vulnerable.
And maybe Mark Clark is more than a hero for a day. That actually brings up one of the other interesting things that I was thinking about when you were talking about this, which was the Louisiana and the Carolina maneuvers in the United States that a lot of people don't know about. These were full-blown war operations that were fought in the Red River area of Texas and in the Charlotte area, actually. And these were full operations where the United States put troops in the field and had them pretend they were fighting. So this is very similar to this wargaming discussion of what survives first contact. And one of the issues was the United States had a lot of Army officers that did not come out of those maneuvers looking very good,
because they hadn't had the opportunity to actually move these, to actually do anything, to actually command troops and supply them and move them. This isn't sitting at Gettysburg moving rectangles on a map. This is getting out and using modern mechanized warfare. So I think that is one of the things that actually helps the United States, because when we're thinking about what Derby House does, Derby House is able to almost sharpen its teeth on a real enemy. And that's what the United States is trying to do in this situation, and put its leadership to that audit of actually performing.
And the place to lose is on the floor of Derby House versus out in the Atlantic. The place to lose is in the American South during an exercise instead of actually in the actual war itself. And so that's the value of accurate wargaming or war planning or tactical simulations in terms of their impact on the real world. Is you learn what works, you also learn what doesn't work, and you fix that before it doesn't work in the real theater.
And more specifically, who doesn't work?
True.
Yeah.
Because back to the idea, Robert brought this up about, the way that Agile, for example, there are some commanders that are better at recognizing what's different about this and adapting what they do. They don't just have their one go-to way of doing it. They're flexible, they're adaptable. And I think if you look throughout the history of warfare for millennia, you find that that's the magic, because eventually there will come a point when whatever has worked the last 9 times is not going to work time number 10. And the commander that can actually recognize that before the 10th battle is way ahead of the game. Or the one who can immediately recognize, oh, this is different, now I'm going to adapt in real time, is also well ahead of the game. And the very fact, again, what they were doing at Derby House was not an entirely new concept. Generals have been pushing things around boards for, again, millennia. But in terms of the way it was being done in real time and an iterative coming back into the battlefield tactical type of thing, I think that is somewhat unique to the 20th century use of, as Robert was talking about, what was different before, even in the American military academies, and what they would do compared to this, and what they do today is also very different.
The one thing I'm thinking about, this is kind of a function of technology, because previously, now, why is Bletchley important? The reason Bletchley is important is because you can intercept the U-boat communications when they're trying to organize a wolf pack. You can radio out to a convoy and ask them to change. So your iterative ability, how many cycles you can go through, is vastly different.
Right.
It's doing that, but it's also that ability to communicate instantly with each other. That is the 100% huge difference with it.
And again, the things that have happened between World War I and World War II, which are, to me, it's always fascinating. Part of it is also just seeing, the difference in the film capabilities and photography, even. So, part of it is just you get better images because it's World War II. You have more accurate, moving film versus, what sort of there is in World War I, because the technology is very adaptive in that very short period of time. And to your point, communications technology has evolved tremendously during that time frame that they're, radio taking the place of telegraph wire. That's one of the differences between World War I, which also makes those communications less secure. The very reason they can be better intercepted is the fact they're not traveling. You can intercept things over a wire, and certainly that happened during World War II. I mean, there were a lot of efforts to make sure that happened, but it's easier to intercept the literally over the air communication versus the closed loop communication of a fixed wired system. That's part of the difference between World War I and World War II. Then fast forward to today's modern battlefield, encrypted satellite communications, real time, the things that go with that takes it to 10 levels beyond that. But adapting that technology as part of what was going on at, as you say, in both Bletchley and at Derby House is part of what's happening there.
I'm thinking about something that's literally in the news right now and is a really interesting, if it's true, I think this is a really interesting development from it, which is, and I have my doubts about this, but the idea that the United States has intercepted a order to go to war and invade another country. Imagine if Chamberlain could have intercepted Hitler's order to invade Poland.
He maybe could not have stopped it, but the response to it, the ability to intervene on it, or to exercise diplomacy, saying, if you do this, we will do that, would have been brought to bear that certainly is not there. And of course, I think you're obviously making reference to a little place called the Ukraine, a little place called Russia. I was watching something even tonight on the news before we were recording here about, some of what's going on there. It's a fascinating thing because it's like almost a hot war in real time, but it's also in slow motion, if that makes any sense. That's how it feels to me, which is sort of weird and strange. Anything big we're missing here on this one, guys? I don't think this one's going to go long because it's a little bit more of a narrow topic, but I guess on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being didn't really matter, 10 being without this, we would all be speaking a different language as we're recording this podcast, probably being on the other end of that spectrum. Where would you rank the work of Derby House, the work of the Wrens that were there, and the work of the Western approach's tactical unit on a scale to 1 to 10 on impacting the war? Robert, I'll start with you.
I'm going to give it a 6.
Okay.
I think,
why that high, and maybe why not higher?
I'm thinking that high because I really do think, I don't know if we could have ramped up fast enough to prevent, if not a full British capitulation. How about this? It gets bad enough that King George runs across the Atlantic to Canada. At a minimum, think about it. It gets to that point that, okay, maybe, Churchill's not leaving the bunker at 10 Downing no matter what. I have a feeling he's gonna sit there and greet the German commander when he comes in and maybe shoot him just because that's Churchill. But he does the Queen, or even what if the King stays, but he sends his Queen and future Queen Elizabeth out of the country? I'm thinking that is probably a distinct possibility. And how does that change her outlook as she's moving through, as she's getting ready to celebrate her 70th year on the throne?
Well, we know from what we've discovered from history that the Germans had ideas about who they might install as king, but that's a whole other
that's a whole other topic.
That's a whole other topic for a whole other day, and we've covered that a couple of times. I'll probably put the links into some of those episodes that we've done on Fork in Time, but that was a real thing as well, the idea of what you would do instead. Chris, 1 to 10, where do you put it?
It depends on what language you're expecting people to be speaking. I think we're still speaking English. I kind of give it a 3 to 4 because maybe they're speaking a different language in Europe. I don't, we're in the United States. I don't see it really coming over here. I think it changes kind of the axis of how the world, or of how the war works, from I kind of talked about, rather than a east-west kind of Normandy pushing east, maybe a south to north, because we can work in the Mediterranean a little bit easier. As long as you still have the United States and the Soviet Union getting into war, when they do, I don't see any way that German's the language being spoken. I guess that's the best way to say it.
And so would I think what I heard you say earlier, what I hear you saying there, it's more impactful not on the outcome of World War II in terms of who would be the victors and the losers, but what it looks like after the war is over in terms of the post-war world.
Where that line is, where the Iron Curtain is, and whether the Iron Curtain just happens to match the Atlantic Wall.
is a very different world,
Yes.
to say the least. To say the least. Well, all right. You guys have anything else before we close it out here?
No, I think that's a fair assessment, Chris. Either way, because even in my scenario, I think we win the war at the end of the day. It takes longer, it's more costly, and at a minimum, post world is affected because everything looks different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I am fascinated. We did the episode there talking about Rome falls to the Allies, literally as D-Day is getting ready to happen, kind of things. But to Chris's point and to your point, Robert, as well, the way we think of the war, as Chris was describing it, they're more south to north in terms of the Allied success versus west to east. I think is a big part of that. The other thing, if you change the timing there, I think the other thing you do change is what Germany can commit potentially to the Eastern Front a little bit more readily. And so, does that alter anything on that side of the war? Maybe pushes back against somewhat Chris is talking about there because they're able to devote more resources. But ultimately, that was also going to be a numbers game. That was a numbers game as well at the end of the day. Eventually, there are enough Russians that you've just got more Russians than Germans, and that's what it's going to be.
But I do have something that just popped to my mind, which is kind of the problem with the Battle of the Atlantic affecting the Eastern Front is you don't have submarines on the Volga. You've put your industrial capacity into making these decisions on a strategic level about what you're going to produce. And it's harder to shift that stuff around. But here's something I am going to think about. If we are not having the success against the U-boats, which Derby House allows, the United States is fighting another front with naval assets that can very easily be shifted. So maybe it's a matter of the United States is able to, because again, thinking about the war in the Pacific, the turning point is 6 months into the war. After that, we are just pushing Japan back. It is very easy to shift that capacity to the Atlantic. So I think that might be another interesting rope to pull.
Yeah, where you're not as dependent upon what we've identified here as the success of Derby House, because you're able to bring the numbers over from the Pacific theater to the Atlantic theater, and you change the balance there.
Right.
And we've talked so many times about, in so many different episodes on both of the shows about, all around the what ifs, and we constantly find ourselves at the end of World War II wanting to move boundaries and lines around because that's the nature of what it is. And one of the things I do wonder about there to a degree is I think about, when we think about a nuclear weapon in World War II, we think about the use against Japan because there was not a need to use it against Germany or to use it as a threat against Germany. But again, if you alter the timing and you have the availability of a little boy or a fat man, and you're still at war with Germany, is it only used in the Pacific theater? Is it threatened for use? Is it used in the Pacific theater, making it very explicitly clear this will be used in the European theater next unless you capitulate? I think about, all the what ifs there. And again, this is not the what if podcast. We'll circle back around on some of these topics, probably on a fork in time. But it's always interesting to me when we alter the war, we end up talking more about altering the post-war oftentimes than we do about altering the war, because it seems inevitable that once certain things are put into motion because of just output capacity, geography, and other things, it's inevitable that Germany loses. But how Germany loses and when Germany loses affects a lot of other stuff.
First, it is used against Germany. There is something very just in my mind, for some very personal reasons, about that weapon being used against Germany. Two, I think in this scenario, by the way, and if you look at the Manhattan Project, they're not even thinking about using it against Japan. They're thinking about using it against Germany.
But yeah, they pulled. Matter of fact, there was a lot of discussion among the scientists after Germany surrendered. Well, why are we still working?
So
Yeah, they were at the point of, well, we beat Hitler. Who cares?
so I think it goes. I think we do have it. I think we may use it. I'm a little again unsure of whether there's any Nazis in Germany by the time we do get it. They might have been driven out of what is today Germany to use it, but I do think the United States uses it. And I do think the other interesting thing is, how does this play back in the Pacific theater where we have used it? But by the way, maybe we may not even have the Marianas. We may not have the capacity to deliver this to Japan because of the shifting of naval resources to the European theater.
It slows the Pacific theater down. Basically, we win at Midway, we shift the resources, and we slow that entire campaign down. So MacArthur keeps his Australian campaign, but the Marine Island hopping doesn't happen because we're having to use those resources.
Right. And so
Well, there's a good Fork in Time episode.
What I was about to say, if our listeners have enjoyed the last 5 minutes more than they enjoyed the first part of the show,
I know.
listen to our other podcast, because it's just in our DNA. It's in our blood to go to what if scenarios, because that's what we do, even on the podcast that we say is more specifically designed around the real history. So unless you guys have anything else, I'm going to go ahead and close out the show. And I'm going to thank Chris and Robert who are an integral part of our team for joining us today. I'm missing a couple of the other members of our team for good reasons. So they'll be back either on an episode of A Fork in Time or The Room Where It Happened. You can find us in both places. Encourage our listeners to go and visit us at www.aforkintimepodcast.com, which is the home of both of our shows, The Room Where It Happened, what you're listening to, as well as the original mother show, the source of all history shows, at least as far as I'm concerned, in terms of participating in podcasts, which is the Alternate History podcast that we do there. And we invite you to go there and check out past episodes of this show, the other show, how you can contribute, how you can be a part. If you think, they didn't say what I wanted to say, I'd like to be part of that team. If I'd have been there, I'd have said something different. There's a chance for you to be that. Just go out and join the team. And be part of us there. We did that. Both of you did
that with the Edward episode.
Yeah.
I had issues with the way it happened.
So we came back around and created a new fork just for Chris to be able to do that. So again, I appreciate you guys. I appreciate you that are listeners. One of the things we would encourage you, if you enjoy the show, you notice there was no ad break in this show. We do that very intentionally. And so if the show has value to you, there at our website or our Patreon page, which is Patreon/A Fork in Time, you can see how you contribute to the show for as little as $2 a month. We have an option there that's as small as $2 a month. It's $2 for two options. Sort of, it's the Fork in Time concept. That's where that came from. And again, we're not going to retire on our earnings here from the podcast, but it does help defray the cost of the show. So I certainly appreciate that. So on behalf of Robert and behalf of Chris, this is Don signing off for this month's The Room Where It Happened. We have not yet decided next month's topic. Normally we tease next month's topic. So what we will do in the feed for this show, as well as in the feed for Fork in Time, is we will put out a little teaser here in the next couple of weeks so you know what's coming. And we certainly invite our folks, once they know what the topic is, go to the website. We normally set up a forum page for each episode there. And so you can actually go in and post questions, post thoughts, the types of things we can be looking at while we're recording the episode to answer your questions or to bring thoughts into play. So maybe you can't join us to talk, but you have some ideas about the topic that we're looking at. So again, this is Don signing off for the team here. Hope you guys have a great day and listen to us next time. Thanks.